Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your Eyeopener report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. In recent weeks, Patrick Clausen, Director of Research for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, attracted attention and headlines for a speech he delivered at last month's Washington Institute panel on how to build U.S.-Israeli coordination on preventing an Iranian nuclear breakout. Unfortunately for him, the attention was not due to the quality of his speech, but to the remarkable nature of his open musings about the necessity to use duplicity in starting a war with Iran.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
Clausen goes on to suggest that a mysterious downing of an Iranian submarine could get Iran to retaliate, thus provoking them into war. But it is the choice of historical precedents that Clausen points to in this clip that is particularly revealing. Fort Sumter, the USS Maine, the Lusitania, the Gulf of Tonkin, Pearl Harbor. All of these attacks are united by one key distinction. They are all examples of fabrications, exaggerations, or provocations that were knowingly used to draw the United States into an unpopular war. As Clausen mentions in his video, the first shots in the Civil War were provoked by Lincoln when he sent a hostile fleet, euphemistically named the Relief Squadron, to Fort Sumter, a move which he knew would provoke a response by the Confederacy. This technique of deliberate provocation was similarly employed by the U.S. against the Japanese prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, had noted in his diary the week before the attack that he had discussed in a meeting with Roosevelt how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Even though the Japanese naval codes had been deciphered long before the attack, and a newly declassified memo has emerged showing that FDR had been warned of an impending Japanese attack on Hawaii just 3 days before the events at Pearl Harbor, the history books still portray Pearl Harbor as an example of a surprise attack. The U.S. was drawn into the Spanish-American War by the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, an event which William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire was quick to blame on the Spanish. Although it is now widely believed that the explosion of the Maine was due to a fire in one of its coal bunkers, the initial lurid reports of Spanish involvement stuck, and the nation was led into war. The U.S. entry into World War I, meanwhile, was facilitated by the sinking of the Lusitania, a British ocean liner carrying American passengers that was torpedoed by German U-boats off the coast of Ireland, killing over 1,000 of its passengers. What the public was not informed about at the time was that just 1 week before the incident, then First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill had written to the President of the Board of Trade that it was most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hopes especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. Nor did reports of the attack announce that the ship was carrying rifle ammunition and other military supplies. Instead, reports once again emphasized that the attack was an out-of-the-blue strike by a maniacal enemy, and the public was led into war. In August 1964, the public was told that the North Vietnamese had attacked a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin on 2 separate occasions. The attacks were portrayed as a clear example of communist aggression, and a resolution was soon passed in Congress authorizing President Johnson to begin deploying U.S. forces in Vietnam. In 2005, an internal NSA study was released concluding that the second attack, in fact, never took place. In effect, 60,000 American servicemen and as many as 3 million Vietnamese let alone as many as 500,000 Cambodians and Laotians, lost their lives because of an incident that did not occur anywhere but in the imagination of the Johnson administration and the pages of the American media. Mr. Clausen may have been relying on the assumption that that portion of his audience who would object to these methods in provoking a war with Iran, and possibly the beginnings of World War III, would be too historically ignorant to know these facts. Amazingly, he is not even the first political insider to openly muse about the utility of using a staged attack to draw Iran into war. In 2007, Globalist insider and CFR member Gary Hart wrote a virtually identical warning to the Iranian government about the US government's ability to use staged and provocateur events to start a war. In Hart's warning, entitled Unsolicited Advice to the Government of Iran, he similarly cites the Gulf of Tonkin, USS Maine, and Pearl Harbor as historical precedents for such an incident. Predictably, Hart was never confronted on these statements by the mainstream media, but when confronted by independent citizen reporters at We Are Change, he admitted that he was warning of a possible false flag attack that was being planned at the highest levels of the US government to justify a bombing strike on Iran.
What I was tongue-in-cheek saying was that we have an administration in Washington that is dying for a reason to bomb Iran. And so in a mock blog letter to the Iranian government, not the president, but the Iranian government, I just simply said, unless you people want to be bombed, you better be careful about cross-border incursions. And I think I explicitly said, keep the Republican Guard or the Revolutionary Guard or whatever it's called away from the Iraqi border. I was trying to communicate to the American people what our own government was trying to plan, and that was to find a reason for bombing Iran. And I was simply saying, in effect to the American people through this mock letter, be very careful about this administration creating a USS Maine incident or a Gulf of Tonkin incident that would justify bombing Iran. That's all.
In 2008, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh revealed a plan drawn up by Dick Cheney to build fake Iranian PT boats and to dress US troops up as Iranians in order to attack American ships, thus tricking the public into believing that the Iranians had attacked America.
There was a meeting among the items considered and rejected, which is why the New Yorker did not publish it on grounds that it wasn't accepted. One of the items was, why not, there was a dozen ideas proffered, how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 irate boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives, and it was ejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation.
More worrying than these statements, however, are the actions that have been taken in recent years to actually pin various bombings and even cyber attacks on the Iranian government. The warmongers in Tel Aviv and Washington now appear desperate to pin any major terror event on the Iranian government in their desperate attempt to rally the public behind this new, potentially disastrous military gambit in the Middle East. In October of 2011, the US Department of Justice, mired in the scandal over the Fast and Furious scheme to openly sell guns to Mexican drug lords, attempted to divert attention by claiming to bust a plot by Iran to assassinate a Saudi diplomat in the United States. The far-fetched plot supposedly revolved around the Iranians attempting to hire a Mexican assassin who turned out to be a paid informant of the US Drug Enforcement Agency. Even at the time, the story was roundly derided as political scaremongering by much of the international community, and the case quickly fell from the headlines. This year, a new meme has been created, that the Iranian government, already under intense scrutiny for its nuclear program and facing the toughest economic sanctions in the world, is now taking to staging bombings in various places around the world, allegedly to kill groups of Israeli diplomats and/or tourists. The incidents that Tel Aviv has attempted to blame on Iran so far this year include bombings in India, Thailand, Georgia, and Bulgaria. What long-term advantage the current Iranian government would hope to gain, even if the bombings had resulted in the death of Israeli diplomats, is as yet unexplained by those attempting to pin the blame on Iran. In the latest round of hysteria, the Iranians are now being blamed for a denial-of-service attack that we are told is hitting the largest banks in America.
Massive cyber attack on U.S. banks allegedly came from the Middle East. The hackers behind the cyber attacks on major U.S. banks have repeatedly disrupted online banking by using sophisticated and diverse tools that point to a carefully coordinated campaign, according to security researchers. The hackers, believed to be activists in the Middle East, were highly knowledgeable about the defensive equipment used by the banks and likely spent months on reconnaissance, said several researchers interviewed by Reuters, who viewed the assaults as among the strongest and most complex the world has seen to date. In the past 2 weeks, customers of top U.S. banks, including Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bancorp, PNC, and more, have reported having trouble accessing their websites, and unusually high traffic volumes appear to crash or slow down their systems. No thefts have been tied to the hacked sites, but an untold number of customers were not able to pay bills or transfer money from their computers, leaving banks with remediation expenses and customer irritation as the biggest costs. Now, James, to flesh this story out, and again, this is one of those stories you kind of have to go looking for the information. An interesting piece from Pack Alert Press, Cyber Attack on U.S. Banks is Obvious False Flag, where they wrote an article a few weeks ago called "The New World Order Agenda Would Move Forward with This One Simple Act," that stated that the one event that could accomplish all of the agenda's goals would be a false flag cyber attack on Western banking institutions that they could pin on Iran. And now we get to the heart of it. So, James, what are the possibilities that Iran, so angry, and the Muslims so angry about this Innocence of the Muslims video, that they hatched this amazing cyber attack? These would be the same people who were essentially destroyed by Stuxnet. And who made Stuxnet, James?
Was it the US and Israel? Oh, I think it was. So far, no evidence has been provided for this assertion either. That the warmongers are so desperate to frame Iran for any and every attack taking place in the world is worrying, to be sure. But at the end of the day, perhaps there is something hopeful we can take away from this. The fact that the Patrick Clausens and Gary Harts and Dick Cheneys of the world are dreaming up their provocations and incidents to justify an invasion of Iran means that, at the very least, some measure of justification is still needed to embroil the NATO powers in another war. Once again, we find that it is the people who hold the power, and it is the people who must be convinced about the need for this war. Here in 2012, now 9 years after the debacle in Iraq, and 1 year after the debacle in Libya, the public is going to need more convincing than ever that it is necessary to deploy the war machine yet again for another round of military adventurism. And now that the mainstream media has expended whatever was left of their credibility pimping the weapons of mass destruction propaganda, the so-called political elite realize that nothing less than a spectacular provocation will do to rouse the public's ire. In contrast, our task is very simple: to inform the public about the history of false flag terror and how the warmongers are now openly signaling their willingness to use these duplicitous methods to get the public into war. Given the deep mistrust that exists at all levels of society for the war machine and its political mouthpieces, this should be a relatively easy task. But this is no excuse for us to rest on our laurels, for if we don't succeed in inoculating the public against whatever false flag incident the neocons hold up their sleeve, the consequence could be the beginning of a third world war. This video is brought to you by the subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information on this and other topics, please go to BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information and commentary from James Corbett, please go to CorbettReport.com.